Welcome to episode 2 of my narrative inquiry on what does it mean to be Acadian. Today we are meeting with Cajun Aaron Broussard to talk about Cajun culture.
Question, which kind of ignited um, this whole research project for me is what does it mean to be Acadian? So, what to you? What does it mean to be Acadian?
Wow. On one hand, if I had to say it in one word, I would say everything. But it's changed over time. As a kid, uh, I think commonly, especially being Cajun, Acadian, uh, we everyone essentially knew that our ancestry was French. There's no doubt about that. I mean, grandparents spoke French. Had French in music. It was French names everywhere, French food. So there was no doubt about that. But I don't know that there was a lot of understanding of the history of the link to the Acadian history, if you will. Some people knew, yeah, we had ancestors in Nova Scotia. They were somewhat aware of that, but I don't think that there was generally just a lot of education or understanding of the history. Over time, as I've gotten older, um, I've become more interested in it. As a child, the uh, the Cajun or French music, as they used to be called, uh, I wasn't as interested in that. I kind of assimilated into the predominantly English speaking culture, music, everything else. As I got older, uh, it's almost the opposite. I embrace the French music. I embrace the culture, the food, just everything that is Cajun, everything that is Acadian. Uh, I desire. I read books about it. I watch documentaries about it. It's just um, if I could devote myself full time to it, I would. But um, it's something that I desire to pass on to my children. I want to make sure that they're aware of where they come from. And honestly, yeah, I think it's a proud history. I mean, especially when you look at the what they went through, the deportation, how they were resilient, how they were able to survive that. Um, and of course, I mentioned earlier the ancestry to the resistance fighter, Joseph Broussard, de Beausoleil, and also his brother Alexander. So I've studied that quite a bit. There's still a whole lot more I would like to do. I'm surprised, frankly, that there's not a movie that has been made about it. Um, I think it would be, an amazing movie. But it's something that um, any chance I get to talk to someone about it, any chance I get to read up about it, I want to take that opportunity. I mentioned earlier, you know, by no means am I even close to being fluent, but I do have a desire to learn French. Um, there are French immersion schools and things like that in Louisiana now, which is good, but it's an uphill battle trying to get French back. So, but that's something that I'm trying to, at least on my own, and uh, and even with my own children, trying to incorporate uh, some French intermixed with with English or just some phrases or words and things like that. Um, and as much as we can, if that makes sense. Between my wife and I, we try to insert stuff here and there.
Definitely, that makes sense. That's how I'm trying to do it with my youngest kid now. And it's been interesting because each child, I've had a different experience with the whole French relationship that we've been having, but it's interesting. I just kind of like learn as I go, and each child we take it at their own pace. So, would you say everything that you believe now is this different than kind of what your perspective was as a child on what it meant to be Acadian?
Um, it's a much deeper understanding, I think, now than when I was younger. When I was younger, it was just, like I mentioned before, I lived other places and I would come back to South Louisiana. It was like a culture shock every time because um, the rest of the United States is just not like that. So when you come down to South Louisiana, especially, and I'm talking like the 1980s, 1990s, it was just a very, different environment, like a different culture. Especially those that were probably 50 or older, um, spoke French, and you would hear French quite often. Uh, you would hear French quite often at supper. You would hear it just around town. You just hear it all the time. And then of course, as I got older, less and less. Um, but yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought. The daughter's walking around. Uh, but but yeah, I mean, the other thing that I would say, just on a personal level, I think is, and I don't think it's necessarily, but if you look a requirement or anything like that to understand the culture, but like I mentioned before, and I think historically, most Acadians were Catholic, most Cajuns, same thing. Um, for me personally, I was baptized Catholic, but my parents raised me as Protestant essentially. As I got older, uh, I guess, once I started having children and things like that, I started kind of looking into that and ultimately came back to the Catholic Church. And so, in a sense, at least for me, I felt almost a deeper connection to being Acadian. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but to me anyway, I felt like a deeper connection to the Acadian history. And once I, was fully, I guess, back in the Catholic Church. And so, um, like I said, I didn't do that because of being Acadian. It was purely outside of that, I did, but it did feel like, I don't know, I had a deeper connection with the history and just the faith of the people and everything that they went through, and in a way that I hadn't had when I was younger, when I just studied it and read about it. Just couldn't relate or couldn't understand it, and maybe in the same way or in as deep a level. So
So it brought you kind of another layer of understanding.
right, and kind of understanding their, and also the family relationships too. How they were able to just kind of support each other, and I guess keep hope. Some of these families were split up for decades, and then they would finally meet back up again, which is just it's crazy to think about. It's almost unimaginable today, but just what they went through, just to either make it, the ones that made it back to, Acadie made it back to, the previous Acadian lands, or I guess at that point would have been French territory, or the ones that, were assimilated into the East Coast of the United States, or what's now the United States, or made it all the way down to Louisiana.
Yeah, I would love to learn more about my family history in that way. I know enough to know that my family did make it to Louisiana and we made it back to
Oh
Acadie,
wow.
but I don't know right offhand like the names of my ancestors or anything like that. It's all
Yeah.
written down somewhere, thankfully, but it's yeah, something that I'd like to learn more about.
Right. Well, see, I always thought that my ancestors were part of the deportation initially, and then as I started to study it, I realized no, at least on the Broussards that I'm directly related to, at least anyway, were able to escape into the woods, and before they were deported, and essentially just, I'm assuming with the aid of maybe some French and some of the Mi'kmaq, may being able to survive, and then they would conduct, kind of raids on, British convoys and things like that. And then ultimately they had to surrender once they ran out of food, and were imprisoned there in Halifax. And so, and I'm surprised too that, in some ways when I read the history, that I'm even alive today, because it seems like the British didn't like him too much. And it seems like there was multiple times where uh, he, certainly could have been imprisoned more than once, or maybe even executed. I read one, just real quick. I read one example that, is it Louisburg, the fort there? Is
Hmm.
that is that is that correct? Uh, that he was there with the French, and at one point launched a raid with, I would say, I don't want to say the exact number and get it wrong, but so don't quote me on this, but maybe 20-ish or so, maybe 30. It was a combination of Acadians and Mi'kmaq that he was working with. Conducted a raid on a British camp, captured a British officer, brought him back, but then Louisburg fell. And so he had just done all this, and then the fort fell, and then he was able to negotiate with the British colonel and say, "Hey, well, I'll negotiate on, with the Mi'kmaq for you," almost like they just kind of forgave, whatever, transgression he did, so to speak, in their eyes. And so there's multiple examples of that, or they talk about this one called Beausoleil, referring to him. Maybe it was kind of like an alias to where they wouldn't maybe recognize who he was and link the two. But there's just it's so much history that I would just love to be able to go back and, just study and, learn more about. So,
So this kind of brings me to our the next question, which is, Do you think that English Acadians are less Acadian due to assimilation?
I huh. Well, it's hard for me to say that because I'm not, uh, I'm not fluent in French, so I don't know if I could fully, answer that. Um, for my grandparents' generation, those that were French was their first language. They were fluent in that. Um, English was their second. For them, obviously, they were, I would say, Acadian. For myself, yes and no. I don't know if there's really a right answer to say one way or the other. Um, I think it's possible, like maybe for myself, where I think it's possible to embrace it even if you don't fully, know the language or fluent in it. Still be proud of it, still support it. I still support the efforts to speak French. I still want to speak French. Um, like I said before, I listen to French music. Don't always understand it, word for word, but I still, it's just I don't know how to explain it. You hear it and it just stirs up something in you. That's all. I don't know how to explain it. Even the land, like South Louisiana, especially, when I get to a certain parish line, so to speak, it's like I'm home, you know. And I've heard some Acadians, at least when I've read about it, even in, some of the territories you've spoken of, historically, they've kind of felt a similar, attachment to the land. Most of them were farmers, for generations. And so maybe that's part of it. I don't know. For my family, my grandfather rather was the first one that wasn't a farmer. Before that, they were all farmers. And so it's a long line of that as well. But yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of, people of Acadian descent that have assimilated. And so they either uh, maybe that from no fault of their own, they just don't know their own uh, history, their heritage. It's not cool. It's not, now the food's cool now to be, especially Cajun food. And don't get me started on that. They throw some seasoning and then they call it Cajun. And but anyway, that's a whole other thing. But, um, it's one of those things, you have a lot of people now claiming to be Cajun or Acadian, um, for whatever reason. But, uh, historically, genealogy, when you look at genealogy, it's just not there. The language isn't there. They don't have that background. So, um, anyway, there's a lot of that too. But I guess, yeah, it's I think, like I said, there are some that have just, totally assimilated. And I think for English speaking, Acadians like myself, um, uh, just kind of what I said before, I think that it's still possible to embrace the culture and everything, and try
So,
to pass that on.
um, kind of related to something that you said, do you feel that you're amongst one of the first generations where it's cool to be Cajun
I
and that
think
it's
it
like
happened.
acceptable? Like when did this shift happen?
Um, the shift happened. So
Yeah,
do you mind repeating the last question again? I'm sorry.
sure. It's not one of my official questions, but it kind of just came off with something
Okay.
that you said. When did it become like what generation or when did it become
Oh.
popular to become Cajun?
Uh, I think so. Like I mentioned before, my grandfather back he was born in 1935. When he went through elementary school, they weren't allowed to speak French in schools. I talked about that earlier. They were punished. They had to write, "I will not speak French in school," 100 times on the chalkboard, all this kind of stuff. Fast forward to World War II. Um, you had, Cajuns, predominantly Acadian descent in Europe, North Africa, French-speaking countries, French-speaking areas, and many of them they came to find out that hey, they can communicate with the local population, and they would start using them as interpreters. Um, and one thing that was interesting with that generation was when they came back, uh, this French language, they were told in schools that no one could speak, no one would understand them. They realized that's not true. It's a different dialect, maybe a different word choices and things like that. Uh, but uh, but they could communicate, especially with the rural areas, the farmers, they had no problem communicating at all whatsoever. And so you saw that with music. It kind of picked up after that. So that generation, when they came back in the 1950s, 1960s, really in the 1960s is when you had the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana, Codafil, they call it. That's where you started seeing French immersion schools. That's when big push to try to reintegrate French. And perhaps maybe it was a little, uh, some people might say too little, too late, but it was a push to bring it back. As far as when it became cool, it's hard for me to say exactly when. It's hard for me to say exactly when. I know, um, I guess maybe in popular culture in the last couple of years, and down in Louisiana, even today, they don't really use the term Acadian so much. I mean, those that are of Acadian descent know of it, but it's predominantly just Cajun. You'll just hear Cajun. Um, but uh, it's used kind of loosely, and like I said before, you'll have people who are not of you know even of Acadian descent, not even of French descent, that'll claim they're Cajun, um, just because they live in a certain geographical area, or maybe they have some of the same interests, or maybe they enjoy, the same taste in music or what have you. And so there's a different groups within Louisiana that have differing uh, takes on that too. You have some that have tried to preserve, I guess, what you may call traditional French, like when they first brought in teachers from France and Belgium and things like that in the immersion schools. But that's a different French than, you know, Acadian French or Cajun French. And so they were essentially being taught almost like uh, I don't know, and you know better than I would, but
European French.
right. It was just different. And even today, they still do that. And why that is, I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, they still do that to this day, and I'm not sure where that started or why that's continued.
It's the same
Um,
thing I don't mean to interrupt, it's the same thing they do here in New Brunswick, because the French that we learn in the core French system is European French. But then, like I was saying previously, when I was teaching French classes, conversational French, the bilingual students wouldn't understand what folks were saying in different parts of the province because the dialects are different.
yeah.
And we're using archaic ancient French sometimes that's been isolated. So it doesn't, we're having a hard time communicating with the European French
Mhm.
folks, right? So you're running
Yeah.
into the same, sounds like the same issues.
Well, I actually did an interview a while back with a veteran that was in Europe and France, uh, around World War II or just after World War II, and he would say things like, he gave me a couple examples, and he said, because I asked him, what do you mean by that? Because he said it's like we spoke like an older version of French. So like when the French would hear us speak, it was like they were hearing like their grandfather or great grandfather speak French. And so he said there were words like for car, we would use the term like buggy, for example. And they'd be like, almost like they would laugh, like buggy, you mean car, but it was just a different word choice, but they meant the same thing. But it wasn't so much different that they couldn't understand what each other meant. It wasn't like they were speaking, what are they saying? It wasn't that, but it was just different word choices. Um, and I guess my understanding of the Acadian French was that, they picked up words from and maybe made up certain words that were uniquely Acadian. And then same thing happened with those Acadians that came to Louisiana. Same thing. Because there just weren't words for things that existed there that didn't exist in Europe, that didn't exist in Acadia, and Acadie. So there's things in, what do you call a swamp? What do you call an alligator? And there's all these different terms for animals and just nature and things like that and food and crops and things like that. So
Yeah, the dialects I'm sure would be really interesting to hear depending on where you are in Louisiana.
they used to say, and I doubt it's so much anymore. Even you know with the older generations especially, they would say that they could tell the dialects and they could tell what part of Louisiana they were from. The French dialects. Um, of course, there's fewer and fewer French speakers, so I don't know if you could say it that way, but even among English, and I know I don't really have so much of like the what you think of as like traditional Cajun accent, but if I'm around it, it seems like it comes back. If I'm around it, everyone's speaking it, it just kind of you pick it up again. But even within English, there's a kind of, some people call it Cajun English. You may have heard, but it's a it's almost like, I guess, the way words are pronounced in the dialect is similar to uh say my grandparents, where French was their first language, but when they speak English, the way they sound, there's a lot of people down there where maybe English was their first language, but the way they talk is very distinct. You can tell that they're Cajun. You can tell that they're, essentially Acadian, right? Just from even when they speak English, you can tell. It's very pronounced. It's very, even when I hear someone talk sometimes and you're out somewhere, if you're not right there, you're like, oh, hey, they must be from, where are you from? That's the first question you ask, because they've got to be from a certain geographical area. Same thing, like if you certain surname, certain last name, same thing. With a name like that, you have to be from. People will say that to me at times. Oh, Broussard. Oh, you have to be from Louisiana. Yeah. Families. You know, and so yeah, it's yeah,
Oh, with your last name, I would have assumed the same thing too, that you're from
yeah,
Louisiana.
right, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so my next question is, do you feel that you've had fewer opportunities as an Acadian? And if so, why? Or maybe you had more opportunities.
Um, I would say that I think I had more opportunities than prior generations. Um, the previous generations, and I've talked to some where, like I said, they were raised on a farm. That's all they knew. Um, they were looked down upon because they spoke French, or even if they spoke English, uh, they weren't necessarily accepted because they had a thick accent. They had uh, if that makes sense. So, for younger generations, they're, I would say, generally, more accepted. You don't really have the same barriers. So I couldn't honestly sit here and say that I had any barriers myself. Um, the only thing I will say, and is not necessarily a barrier, but just one time I had an incident where uh, I was in a workplace and I had a employer, when I first came on board, they saw my name, oh, yeah, it's a Cajun, and they used kind of a slur that I've heard countless times before by Cajuns. It's very common, but the first time I had it said by someone who wasn't Cajun, it just, I didn't expect that. I was like, whoa, but it just, and I don't know if you've heard it before, but it's the word is kunas, and that's it was used by Anglophone, non-Acadians, non-Cajuns, to refer to, and it was basically saying that they were dumb, they were lazy, and it was just kind of this term. There's actually, for years, there's been a debate within the Cajun specific culture whether that word should be used by Cajuns or not. There's uh, Warren Perrin, he's an attorney. He's the one that actually advocated for Queen Elizabeth to issue the Royal Proclamation. He advocates that it shouldn't be used at all, in music, whatever. And then there's been others, musicians and so forth, that have used it and say it's okay, it's not a big deal. And so you have this kind of tug of war, uh, and I would say generally most people that are Cajun don't have a problem with it, but like I said, I didn't think I did either until I heard someone that wasn't Cajun use it, and then the way they used it, it was just like, but that's been the only uh situation that I've had like that. But other than that, I mean, no, I don't think it's affected me in any way. Uh, you know, like I said, I think each subsequent generation, uh, you know, and maybe to an extent, I think, for better or for worse, it was because the Cajuns started adopting the English language. There was the the positives of it was, yeah, they were able to advance. Clara, stop! Hey, that's loud. You need to be quiet, please. Quiet. Sorry.
All
But
right.
yeah, each
I
subsequent
can't hear
generation.
anything, whatever she's doing. I can't hear a
Okay.
sound.
Okay. But each subsequent generation, I think it got easier. But then, it's on the flip side of that, you also had less and less of the culture, less and less of the French language. So it's, that's the pros and cons of it. So
So, would you say growing up that you had any issues around language barriers? Was that something? Because I know you had mentioned wanting
I
to.
have, yes, well, I had language barriers being able to speak French. There were growing up, more so when I was a kid than today. And I think if you went back even further, you'd find that even more so. where French was the dominant language. Maybe not officially, English would have been the official language, uh, but you'd go to certain communities and they're predominantly French. Um, and it would be predominantly people of Acadian descent. As a kid, I heard it all the time, especially at my grandparents' house. All their friends, everyone that they knew were of Acadian descent, Cajun descent. Everyone spoke French. They'd play card games like Bourrée and dance and listen to French music till, all hours of the night until, everyone went to sleep. But for me, the barriers were with some of those older generations that didn't speak English. There were some that only spoke French. And so when I was out there, there was times I wanted to communicate with them, but I had to go through my grandparents or someone else that could interpret and go back and forth between. And I mean, I would pick up stuff here and there, and I could pick up words, but I couldn't hold an entire conversation with them. And so, and looking back on that now, I really regret that because I wish I would have, you know, there's so many questions I would want to ask or so many things I'd want to know. But as a kid, you don't think like that, you don't think about it. Um, but yeah, that's, you know,
It's definitely interesting because when I had these questions in mind, I wasn't necessarily thinking like most of my participants so far have been French first language, right?
yeah.
So hearing it and seeing it from your point of view is interesting as well.
Right, because yeah, and well, another thing I just thought about this when you talk about barrier. My grandfather, when he had cancer and before he passed away, like I said before, French was his first language. That was, um, and he spoke French. I mean, or at least I heard French a lot more when I was younger. But I think that was just because there was a lot more people around him that spoke it as well, so you would just hear it more. When I got older, when he got older, you would still hear it occasionally, but it wasn't as common. Not because he didn't want to speak it; it was just there was fewer people for him to speak it with. And so there's kind of I wish I would have been able to. But what I was getting at is before he passed away, as he was getting sicker, there were times where uh, when he was in hospice and things like that, where he would, I guess, revert to French, if that makes sense, where
Yeah.
he wouldn't speak English. He would only speak French. And there were times I had a hard time being able to understand what he needed, what he wanted. Um, and that was hard because I wanted to be able to speak to him. I wanted to be able to talk to him. And there were some things I understood, but at the same time there was things I didn't. And so I'd have to go get a family member or someone that knew what that meant to be able to, to talk to him. And that's because that was the language he was speaking.
Yeah.
So
Um, I worked in the for the New Brunswick Health Authority for about 5 years doing admin support, and that was a common thing that we would hear
mm,
that people would revert back to their native language when they were either having moments where it was near, the
yeah.
end of their life, or if they were in pain as well. Sometimes people would just revert back to that. So it's definitely really common. Um, yeah, it's an interesting phenomena to see happen.
Hmm. Yeah.
So with that experience, um, you felt definitely that you had some barriers to wishing that you could have been able to speak French at that time.
Hmm.
Um, what are your biggest challenges that you felt that you faced as an Acadian?
Hmm. Well, I think the biggest challenge, I think is kind of a broader challenge, is just um, trying to preserve the culture, because as I've gotten in, more, I guess, deeper into it, so to speak, or it's just been more of an interest. Like I said, I mean, I'm kind of I don't want to say Acadian nerd, but like, I mean, anything I can take in or read about, or I love the history. I love the culture, like I said. So, um, by no means am I an expert or anything like that, but I just, I just it's just an interest of mine outside of work and so forth, and it's just something that I want to learn as much as I can so that I can pass it on to my children, as much as I can. I wish that you know wish my grandparents would have passed the language down to my parents, and I wish my parents would have passed it down to me, and so I can't change that, but what I can do is try my best to learn as much as I can so that I don't want it to, you know I'll put it this way. I can remember French being spoken, right? I can remember, how prevalent it was when I was a kid. My kids have heard it somewhat, but I don't want them to have no, memory of that, or them to grow up and just only hear English, never hear French, you know. And so I feel like a responsibility in a sense to try to learn as much as I can to try to pass it on. I feel like I thought, maybe 5, 10 years ago I would know a lot more by now. So I feel like I failed in that sense, but still a goal. It's still something I'm going to try to pursue. Um, you know,
So that's interesting that you say that. What do you feel that when you're looking back on that, why do you feel that you haven't accomplished enough?
well, I guess, I'll give you, I studied the Acadian history a little bit back when I was doing my bachelor's degree, and that was, almost, well, not quite 20 years ago, but a long time ago. And so, I guess in my mind, I would have thought, oh, by now I would have, uh, I don't know, just studied it more. There's a book called Cajun Self-Taught. It was written by a priest, Cajun, or Acadian, Cajun priest, that was to try to help because to understand the Cajun dialect, essentially. And so I thought, oh, I'll get this. There's CDs, there's books, there's all this stuff because, like, I mean, I can do Duolingo, but that's going to be European French. It's not, it's not going to be Acadian French even, or certainly not going to be Cajun French. And so, and it sounds different. If you hear French spoken, and I've seen even people that are French speaking in New Orleans, it's a different dialect. That's not Acadian French that you'll hear in New Orleans. You got to go to the rural areas. You have to go to the Lafayette area. They call it the Acadian. It's like a triangle region, south region of the state. That's where you're going to hear, that dialect being spoken. And so I guess I just thought that by this point I would have, I don't know, uh, I would know more than I do, if that makes sense. And I thought, that I'd be able to, that my children would even know more than I do, I guess, that I would just teach it to them and they would just, they would pick it up, and they know words here and there, and they enjoy some of the music and stuff. So I mean, uh, there's that. So I mean, it's, there's some inroads, so to speak, where they're interested in it, um, but I feel like there's more that I could be doing and that I frankly should be doing.
Yeah, I get that feeling as a parent as well when it comes to feeling like being the torchbearer for culture that I should be.
Yeah.
Um,
And just real quick too, so within my family, I mean, I feel like I can kind of relate to some of the things you were saying earlier, about just identifying, as Cajun or Acadian, uh, which is within my family. I feel like I'm kind of the the torchbearer, so to speak, as far as studying the history, sharing it with the family. I mean, I've had family members that said, "Oh, I didn't even know that. I didn't know we, had ancestors that were in, Acadie, that the deportation, didn't know anything about it." It was just, and to me, I'm like, that's crazy. Like, how do you not know that? But I mean, no fault of their own. They just, weren't taught it. They just didn't know it. Um, of course, and like I said, they know that they're French, the French ancestry. They may even know of Acadian ancestry, but they don't know the details of the history. Everything that, just the progression of what happened and how they ended up where they are now, and just the background of the culture and how that all, progressed over time. Um, but yeah, I mean, so in a sense, I feel, I guess the more I learn about it, the more I feel like it's a duty to share it. I guess if that makes sense, as much
yeah.
as I can, whether that's genealogy, whether that's history, culture, language, what have you. Okay.
Um, when you were in school, like in high school or middle school, would you have learned anything about the deportation?
No. And maybe I would have, for me, uh, we moved around a lot. So I went to school in Louisiana when I was younger, but by the time I went to high school, I did not. So of course, within the United States, most of the history that you learn may be limited to that state, you know.
Okay.
It's not, so you're not necessarily going to learn about, something that happened in another state, if that makes sense. So it's going to be kind of regional what you learn about, history
That
wise.
definitely makes
So
sense. Yeah.
the one thing that I mean, and I kick myself on this is, and I can't, it's painful to even admit it. I had the opportunity to take French in high school, but I didn't. I took Spanish, why? Like why did I do that? Like now I mean, I think back to that and I'm, just oh, because I would have at least known more than I know now, I would know
Yeah,
the basics. I guess because at the time, French wasn't cool, Spanish was. It's one of those assimilation kind of things. Everyone that knew anyone was taking Spanish. It was kind of a cooler, you know, class to take, what have you. I don't know. I mean, why? I can't explain it, but that's one of those things
probably,
where
well, you probably had more opportunities to use it like
true,
for, I
but
guess,
yeah,
career
but I guess
advancements or whatever, learning
I've never had,
Spanish.
yeah, I've never had to learn. Now, the only thing I'll say that it has helped with when learning French is just the structure of sentences and things like that, nouns and verbs, and so yeah, I guess I understand the placement of things a little bit better because it's different than English, but of course the words aren't pronounced like they're spelled, necessarily, so that's a challenge, whereas like Spanish, the way it looks is how you pronounce it. But with French, it's more difficult. So
Yeah. Um, but I could definitely understand why it was more appealing to take Spanish when you were in high school. It was
yeah,
Spanish is an option in the high schools here too, French or Spanish, and there's a lot of people that take Spanish because it's cool.
yeah,
Cooler than taking French. So, or at least it was 20 years ago. So,
right, right.
yeah. So, um, with where you are now in life, do you plan on doing any, um, I guess, carrying of the torch? Like, what's your next move?
It's hard to say. Um, I follow several historians, Cajun, they're Acadian. When I say Cajun, I'm typically referring to people also Acadian descent. But when I say Cajun, I'm just referring to those in Louisiana. But um, historians that have, were professors that have written books about, Acadian history or Cajun history. I've followed them. I've been interested in what they're doing. For example, one of them is he's actually a historian in his for the Tabasco plant, which is like a hot sauce. He's the historian for there, so he gets kind of some leeway to be able to go off and do some Louisiana history or some Cajun history occasionally, different from just the being the historian for the plant. There's another guy that's a historian for it's a oil and gas is real big down here because of all the plants. That's really what for most part really helped a lot of Cajuns move up. If you think back decades ago from being just farmers to being able to go, that was a way to make money. They didn't have the education, but they could go work offshore in an oil rig and they could make money that way. But anyway, in the Houston area, you have a lot of headquarters for a lot of those companies, and he's a historian for one of those. And so as a kind of a side project he's been doing interviews predominantly of World War II veterans that were Acadian descent or Cajun descent and their ability to speak French and how it impacted um, their ability to communicate with, the French in Europe or even the French speaking people in North Africa and things like that. So there's different groups like that. And I mentioned earlier Warren Perrin, the attorney that, pushed for the Queen's Royal Proclamation. He is now pushing for the UNESCO site somewhere in the vicinity of St. Martinville. It's now St. Martinville, Louisiana. They're trying to establish where, doing digs and archaeological digs and things like that to figure out where the first Acadians, where was their first settlement that was when they arrived from, Acadie, and where they established, and they're trying to link the two locations with one another. And so of course, I would love to be a part of anything like that if I could. But as far as just passing it on, yeah, I mean, uh, when there's certain, uh, dates such as uh, the anniversary of the deportation, for example, or there's an anniversary every year of and the Acadians, they do a festival along the Bayou Teche, which is like a river that runs into St. Martinville where the Acadians first, arrived. And every year there's uh, a basically a Eucharistic procession, and I mean people line the banks of the river, and people show up over there, and it's a big deal. And it's a memorial remembering the Acadians' arrival and where they settled and where they came from, and it's a big deal every year they do that. And so, I guess wanting to preserve that and, bring the family to those kind of events and making them aware of that history, kind of there's really no way, you can watch it, you can read about it, but it's different to be there in person. Um, and uh, just passing that information on to, the family. I mean, like I said before, the more I study it, the more I learn about it, the more I feel obligated that, I have to share this. I have to pass it on because if I don't, who else is going to do it? You know? And so in a sense, I guess for me, I feel kind of obligated to do it, you know? And, I may not be able to affect a lot of people, but at least in my, immediate family and maybe some extended family, maybe I'll be able to, share that with them. So
Definitely, I understand that, feeling like it's important to share the culture. And
yeah.
it's my husband is English. He comes from a very um they look back on their family history and it's a lot of English, pretty much.
Yeah.
I don't think there's really anything else in there. Maybe some
Yeah.
Welsh, that's about it. But the joke between us is that he is trying to assimilate me into his culture, but really,
Yeah.
he is taking on some of the French, right? Like he will speak French,
Yeah.
and he is trying, and our children are learning French, and um, a little
Yeah.
bit at a time.
Yeah. My wife took French in school, and so she knows more than I do, so but the French she knows is more of a, I guess you could say, European French because her teacher was from Belgium, just like I mentioned. So um so I mean, not I mean it's good, but it's a different the dialect's different, versus like what, I heard growing up, you know. But still we're, like I said, trying our best to try to learn and pass on what we can.
Yeah. So are your children, are any of them school age yet?
Yes, yes, and that's what I was saying, I wish I would have taught them more by now as well. I have a 11-year-old, just 10-year-old and a 4-year-old. So uh now I would say in some cases um they're more exposed to the culture than maybe I was at certain points, even with my dad, because we lived away from the culture. And so we largely just kind of assimilated into the larger, American culture, so to speak. But then as I got older, I would say I kind of, I don't know what's the term, kind of, I guess, re-embraced, if you will, the Acadian culture and just, all things that were Acadian, if that makes sense, or, all things that were Cajun. So,
Yeah.
um, kind of like I should have never, gone away from it to begin with, and just kind of wishing in some cases that, uh, maybe that my parents would have been more uh, involved or maybe in sharing the history. I mean, we kind of knew, I mean, I kind of knew, like I said, general things, but it just, I feel like I'm trying to give my kids what I didn't have, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that they
Yeah,
experience
totally.
the exposure. So yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that um it just made me think of like the experience I had growing up was my mom, clearly the last name Savoy is an anglicized version of Savoie, but she never considered herself Acadian because
Mm,
she grew up in the mindset of they assimilated, they became Anglophone, and they dropped that identity. And it was a lot to do with the communities at the time were very, English versus French.
mhm,
So her great grandfather, when he became English, for lack of a better term, um, they dropped that identity. So for generations, none of them identified as Acadians, but really, like, it was as I was rediscovering what it meant to be Acadian and looking back on, questioning my parents, right? Like, "Well, why do you think this way?" Like,
mm,
why is that significant? Like, um, it really made her kind of come to terms with realization as well that, "Oh, yeah, yeah, I am Acadian. Just because, like, we assimilated doesn't make us any less Acadian than the other Acadians." But
yeah,
there's still this deep rooted in this community anyway in New Brunswick of English versus French. It's still a very hot topic today. It's still controlling our school systems. It's still like it's something that's not going to go away, I don't think, anytime soon. So it really impacted my view growing up on what it meant to be Acadian because had this whole English versus French thing, which in reality is a whole separate thing than being Acadian. It's not part of the Acadian identity, and at least in my mind. But for a long time, I had it entrenched in there that I really thought, that to be the perfect Acadian, I had to be super francophone, right? And part
Mm.
of this comes from my father being fully francophone and being a French teacher in the French core French school system, where he
Yeah.
was very European French and very serious about all of his, he would correct us and make sure we were speaking proper French, and to the point where when I would go out to spend time with my friends and I would use proper French, they'd look at me like I had two heads because it was like, why are you using this word when we use this word? Um, so it just added this whole other layer to things too, where I felt like I couldn't fit in because I was always saying the wrong thing, right?
Right.
But my father, I think, had this shame growing up where he came from the generation that being Acadian was shameful. Um,
Mm-hmm.
there wasn't a lot of like he came from a family of 18, so nine boys, nine girls. Most of
Yeah.
them that wanted to continue with education went to Montreal because it was really the next Quebec's the French hub, right? So people would
Right.
leave the province to go to Quebec. But he went to the University of Moncton in New Brunswick, so the only French university in New Brunswick. Um, and it's considered kind of like not necessarily the top tier of, like French universities in Canada. So a lot of struggles coming from an Acadian community going to a French Acadian university, trying to show, the best of being French all the time. Like my father, I hope he doesn't listen to this, but definitely has a complex around his whole French needing to, I guess it's his teacher in him, where he just needs
Yeah.
to kind of correct everyone all the time. And
Right.
I think at one point, to me, it felt like he would, if we were using the Acadian French, we were lesser than, is what it felt like growing up.
Mm.
So that
Okay.
was really hard because I just wanted to fit in with the rest of the kids.
Okay. Yeah.
So there was always this weird um, vibe at home where it was still like a constant English versus French, even though it was like unspoken, right? Because my parents were, one would speak French, one would speak English.
Okay.
So it's just really strange in terms
Okay.
of trying to figure out like what that what that identity was growing up.
Yeah, we didn't have, I wouldn't say we had, the English, French kind of, we didn't have the same issues per se. Um, of course, I can't really speak for some of the older generations that, I'm sure they had issues where, there was a conflict between the two languages and uh, occupations and being able, I'm sure that was an issue. I mean, I know it was, I just don't know enough about how to speak it.
Yeah, and I think in here in New Brunswick it's definitely different in a sense where because we're a bilingual province where you folks are trying to have a resurgence of French. It's not
Right.
quite as front stage as
Right.
what,
It's not and especially with the population now. I mean, if you would have gone back, the older you went back, the more French you would have, the more you would hear. If that whole movement would have started a lot earlier, then I think that it would be a lot different today. And there's certain geographical areas where, you're more likely to hear it, just like there's, certain areas, if you go there, you're probably not going to hear it. And kind of, like I said, there's certain hubs And once you get outside of that, you may still hear it or find someone, but it's going to be, less and less, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me tonight. And I'm probably gonna email you sometime this week with probably some follow-up questions,
Okay.
just because I'm working with someone else on the research, and they
Yeah.
suggested that I contact all my participants to start just kind of like an Excel sheet of basic information on everyone, because right now it's just been me recording the interviews, but I want to get some basic information like um, what your job is, like how old you are, if you want to share that
Right.
kind of information,
Right.
just so I can kind of get a good demographic of everyone, because
Okay.
I have participants from all over North America, and it's been really interesting though, because everyone that's been interested has obviously has a passion for this, right? So the
Right.
people that have
Right.
a passion for it are either people that are into their own family history, discovering stuff about
Mhm.
themselves. So there's been a few people that have been some um, authors that I've come across,
Yeah.
and some things like some one of them was a tour guide at one of the forts in Nova Scotia. So just like people that are generally interested in obviously Acadian history.
Yeah.
I've had people so far from Ile de Madeleine. I don't know if you know where that is. It's a little island just north of Quebec, so very isolated French. Then I have some people that I'm meeting with in the new year, like from Newfoundland. So I don't
Wow.
know if you're, yeah, so from like all over,
All over. Wow.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I have from Upper Canada as well, so from Ontario. But I need to find some more Acadians, and I'm looking for some folks in PEI is where I need to find some people next, because I
Mm.
have most of my I have my maritime provinces, but I'm missing PEI. So
Wow. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, it's definitely when I saw, when you first asked the question on that, because I mean, I think everyone in that group, the Facebook group, is obviously interested in that, in Acadian culture and all that. So when I saw that, I was like, of course, yeah, yeah, I'm interested. So
yeah. And
yeah,
I've had one of my students was from Massachusetts, and she was from Little Canada, so she gave me her perspective.
wow,
And I have a couple of people from Maine too. So I'm excited for that, because
yeah,
I know that in Maine, similar to Louisiana, they weren't allowed to speak French. So I'm
yeah.
really curious to hear about that. I think it's Nadine Pelletier that's I'm going to meet with, and I think she's the
Hmm.
head of the Acadian Association in Maine. So um,
It's interesting how the names are pronounced different because you said Peltier, like Peltier. Because you hear that in Louisiana too, but they would call it Pelche, or you hear it different pronounced just different ways of saying it.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
anyways, I'm gonna let you go because I think
Yeah,
you're
she's
due to
getting
go.
so yeah. No, I appreciate it though.
Yeah. So thank you so much, and I'll be in touch with some follow-up questions. And if you have any questions about what I'm doing with
Yeah.
your information, just
Yeah.
I'm just an email away.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye.